On April 28, 1760, just outside Quebec, the French under Lévis launched a major counteroffensive with a very clear objective: drive the British back and retake the city before reinforcements could arrive by sea. Murray did not wait to be besieged. Instead, he led his troops out of Quebec to fight a decisive battle on the plains of Sainte-Foy.
On ground turned muddy by melting snow and ice, the two armies slammed straight into each other with artillery,
muskets, and bayonets. Within only a few hours, this became one of the bloodiest battles of the war in North America.
After the French defeat on the Plains of Abraham in 1759, Quebec had fallen to the British, but the struggle was still far from over. Winter swept through with brutal force, and the British garrison inside the city was weakened by disease, shortages of food, and the harsh weather. Lévis saw a final opportunity. He marched back from Montreal, bringing with him French regular infantry, Canadian militia, and allied indigenous forces, determined to fight a major battle before the British Navy could sail up the St. Lawrence River.
The battlefield lay on the plateau of Sainte-Foy, southwest of Quebec. The ground favored no one.
Melting snow had turned the earth into mud, patches of old ice had not fully disappeared, and moving artillery or keeping formations steady became difficult. In the middle of this area, the Dumont Mill was an important high point, from which part of the center of the battlefield could be observed and controlled. Whoever held that ground would have a clear advantage once the battle descended into chaos. Murray knew that, if he remained inside the city and endured a prolonged siege, he would be at a disadvantage in numbers, so he chose to strike first. He led the British out of Quebec, placed his artillery on favorable ground, and deployed his infantry in a long line ahead of it. His intention was clear: launch a preemptive blow while the French were still deploying, use artillery to shatter their formation, and then drive the infantry forward to finish the battle quickly. In the opening moments, that plan worked. British guns fired first, pouring shot into the advancing French formations. The red-coated infantry pushed forward strongly, pressing into Lévis' front line and forcing the French to defend themselves before they were fully settled. Across the mud-soaked field, cannon fire thundered in rapid succession, gun smoke hung low over the ground, and the British companies surged ahead in the hope of breaking the French position early. But even in the midst of that advance, problems began to appear. The British pushed too far forward, and their front-line infantry started to block part of the field of fire of their own artillery. The guns that had created the initial advantage could no longer support the attack as effectively as they had at the start. At the same time, the soft ground caused the British formation to lose alignment, and the spacing between units could no longer be maintained evenly. Murray had seized the initiative, but the price was that he had drawn his own army into a close-range fight, where Lévis' numerical advantage would begin to matter. Lévis did not panic when he was hit by the initial blow. He held his front line together, shifted troops to seal the points under pressure, and then gradually tightened the battlefield. From that point on, the battle was no longer simply an opening artillery barrage followed by an assault. It became a direct collision between two infantry lines pressing closer and closer toward one another. As British artillery became less effective, the course of the battle began to change. Murray's troops still maintained pressure in the early stage, but they no longer had enough supporting firepower to finish the fight as quickly as planned. Lévis took advantage of that exact moment. He reinforced the hottest points of the battlefield, especially around the center and the wings, turning the battle into a chain of continuous clashes, rather than allowing the British to preserve a unified offensive. Near the Dumont Mill, the two sides struggled fiercely. The British tried to widen their flank in order to gain a positional advantage, but the French kept pressing forward, closing in and counterattacking at short range. As the muddy ground slowed every movement, the battle quickly turned into a tactical melee. Each battalion had to hold its ground by itself. Officers found it difficult to see the whole field, and victory depended on which unit broke first. The British center began to feel heavy pressure, because he had spread his line wide in order to cover the whole front. Murray's formation was thinner than ideal. Whenever one wing came under threat and needed reinforcements, he had to pull troops from the center or from the opposite flank to support it. Each such adjustment made the British line more fragile. Lévis recognized this and kept pressing evenly, giving Murray no chance to rebuild a solid formation. The real turning point came on the British left. There the French launched their strongest push, forcing the British into the position of firing while falling back. Murray tried to hold the line by throwing his last reserves into the breach, but mounting casualties caused the fighting power of his troops to decline sharply. The frontline units were worn down by volley after volley, then forced into bayonet range, where the weight of the French formation began to tell decisively. Once the British left started to crack, the entire line began to bend and then collapse in a chain reaction. The center lost its support, The right could no longer stand independently, and Murray realized that if he tried to hold on in the open any longer, his army might be completely cut apart. He gave the order to retreat back to Quebec. This retreat took place under tremendous pressure. The British guns that had been brought out to fight a decisive battle now became a burden. The muddy ground made it extremely difficult to drag them back, and many had to be abandoned or disabled while the infantry fought a rearguard action and withdrew. The French tried to press harder and turn their victory into a complete destruction of the enemy force, but in the smoke and confusion they failed to cut off the retreat decisively. As a result, most of the British troops still managed to get back inside Quebec. When the firing at Sainte-Foy finally died down, Lévis was the one left in possession of the battlefield. The French had won a major battle, driven the British back behind the city walls, and proved that they were still capable of launching a fierce counterattack right at the gates of Quebec. But Sainte-Foy was only half the problem. Lévis had won outside the city, yet Quebec itself was still not his. To turn a tactical victory into a decisive success, the French had to capture the city before the British Navy appeared on the St. Lawrence River. That was the real race. After withdrawing into Quebec, Murray did not risk coming out again. He kept his troops tightly within the fortifications, relying on the walls and waiting for reinforcements from the sea. Lévis immediately shifted to a siege, trying to tighten his grip around the city and prepare artillery for an assault. But this was where the major weakness of the French became clear. They did not have enough siege artillery, strong enough and brought forward quickly enough, to smash through Quebec's defenses in a short time. The victory at Sainte-Foy was great, but it did not automatically open the city gates. In the days after the battle, the French maintained pressure from outside, dug in, and waited for an opportunity. Yet each passing day made Lévis' chances smaller. He needed French ships to arrive first, bringing supplies and heavy artillery. If British ships appeared first, the entire advantage won on land would lose its meaning. Then the decisive moment came. In May 1760, sails appeared on the St. Lawrence. At first, neither side knew whose ships they were. But once it was confirmed that they were British warships, the situation was almost instantly settled. Quebec was saved. The British inside the city had reinforcements. The French outside no longer had any real ability to sustain the siege to the end. Lévis was forced to abandon the attempt to retake Quebec and retreat. In that way, Sainte-Foy became a cruel paradox. The French won a major victory on the battlefield, drove the enemy back, and gained control of the ground, yet still could not alter the outcome of the campaign. They won on land, but lost in the race for supply and control of the river. That is what makes Sainte-Foy so remarkable. It was not only a successful French counterattack, but also the clearest example of the fact that, in the final stage of the war, whoever controlled the St. Lawrence controlled the fate of Quebec. Lévis achieved the hardest thing on the battlefield. He defeated the British in a major battle outside the city gates. But he could not achieve the even harder thing: break the city before the sea and the river brought victory back to his enemy.